Hey, Bob. This is Dave. Nice to see you. Okay, where's my... Well, we're live, but we're not really live yet. Everyone's just getting on. There's going to be a big crowd here tonight. Hey, Bob, how you doing? I'm probably muted. Let's see, Robert. Yeah.
I'll say hi, Dave. I'm Matt Kennelly.
Hi, Matt. Nice to meet you. You look like you're actually in an office somewhere.
I am, yeah. I'm at LOTT here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm in an office too, but it's in our house.
Yeah, I've got two. So it's empty right now. So
yeah, okay.
I have the whole place to myself.
Yeah. Yeah, that happens sometimes. It's kind of an eerie feeling sometimes when you're usually surrounded by hundreds of people.
It is. Yeah. Feels good to be in the office, and it feels good to be back home too. So
Actually, when I worked for the state and we had a big office building in Lacey, and I'd be working late at night sometimes, it would be weird to have someone sort of walk into my office, because it's like being at home and someone walks in or something. You're not really expecting it because, hey, it's 7 o'clock and everyone else is left, right?
Right.
Apparently not once in a while,
Right. Yeah.
Although usually it would be the cleaning people or something like that, but
yeah. Yeah.
It has to be someone coming back from, from driving back from someplace, just coming in to drop up.
Right.
Drop off something, pick up something, whatever, go home, Hey, Dave's here. Check on him.
Right.
I remember when I was in the office many years ago, at about 4 in the morning, the police came in.
Oh, man.
Doing there.
They're after you, huh, Bob?
Right. I was trying to catch up on a brief and I was behind time. So that's why I was there at 4 in the morning, but they didn't know what was going on.
Oh, did they come in because you were there?
But yeah, I was the only one there, no bill.
And did they believe you?
Yeah, I knew one of them.
Well, I never had that happen to me, but could have happened.
At any time. Yeah. Good to see you, Dave.
Yeah, good to see you. So that's a memory that should be in your life story, somewhere, Bob. I'm such a hard worker that,
Right.
the cops came to throw me out of the building at 4 in the morning.
I was leaving a board meeting recently, just a few months ago here, and I had a backpack on leaving. My wife was picking me up outside the gate, so I was walking out the gate. We've had some people jumping our fence here at the plant lately, so I was approached by the security guard and operator. They were very polite, but they're definitely, somebody with a backpack on in the dark.
Uh-huh.
There.
Yeah, backpacks has gotten a bad name recently.
Yeah.
If you carry a briefcase, they knew you were a lawyer then, right?
Right. I need to change it up.
Yeah. So, Matt, I'm going to talk about LOTT a little bit, just mostly in comparison to some of the other treatment plants, because, of course, none of the other treatment plants do the kind of nutrient reduction that LOTT does. And I have a slide or two that kind of compares LOTT to some other plants.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. And I figured, since I'm going at the end, I figured whatever I can just kind of move on from anything that I have. So okay. Yeah, that's great.
Well, it's interesting. I think that I was trying to give people a sense of the magnitude of the discharges from, especially, of course, from the King County and Snohomish County treatment plants, which are enormous compared to ours down here.
Right.
And that enormity affects, of course, the amount of nitrogen they discharge as well.
Right.
So. Well, we got the nice title slide up. That must. But
Well, there we are. Is this Olympia? Where are we?
yeah, we're still in someplace. Who knows? Let's see. I can get that off, I think. Kevin's on.
Everyone, are you able to see the full screen or is the taskbar still showing?
Well, no, we see the full slide, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi,
Okay,
Paige.
it's always hard to tell with the presentation view.
Yeah. You're on, and Kevin's on, Matthew's here, Katrina. I don't know who else. Lori Allen. I haven't heard from Lori for quite a while.
Hi, David and everybody.
Hi, Lori. We actually used your name recently. We were trying to remember all the names of the original DERT board members.
Yeah, well, and then we moved to Wenatchee. So Paul and I are very happy to see you guys and hear about what's going on in the waterways, I guess I could say.
Sure. Yeah, it's good to hear from you guys.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Yay. Okay, I'm going to unmute, or I'm going to mute myself now. Okay, bye.
Well, you'll all wish I was muted pretty soon, so. Paige, are you the host for tonight?
Yes.
Okay. So I didn't think I saw in any of the emails how you wanted to handle the presentation. So you or Matthew, but we could be co-host and, or, show our own slides or send them.
Yeah, I figure everyone can share their own slides
Okay.
in case there's any
All right.
issues with that. 'Cause, it's Zoom. You could send them to me and I'll try to share.
Yeah.
Go ahead and try to do that on your own first.
Yeah. We always have to remember how to do that sharing part.
Every time. Yeah, I feel ya. You'd think by now we'd all have it figured out. But
You would think so. Yeah.
Zoom continues to be its own beast.
Well, we're really used to talking to each other on it, but not so much, sharing slides.
Yeah. So we still have people trickling in. I'm gonna give it probably till 6:05 to make sure everyone is here before we dive in.
Okay.
Thank you for everyone that has showed up already. Appreciate it.
Did I see Sean's up on here? I don't see Sean. Oops, sorry. That's all right. Well, I see Lisa on here tonight. Lisa, it's nice to see you again.
Hi, good to see you too.
I'm sure one of these days we'll have in-person meetings again, but I haven't been to one yet.
It feels like they're getting closer.
I think so. Well, if you don't have to wear masks on airplanes, then we're probably getting very close.
We are looking into doing our May forum in person, so fingers crossed we could work that out. We could all join each other, be together in person.
Yeah, but this way we can have former board members from Wenatchee, join us, and that would be hard if it was in person.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to do a hybrid version. We're gonna see how that works out.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting. I think one of the other groups we belong to is going to try to do a hybrid version on Monday. We'll see how that works out.
Yeah, let me know and if you have any tips for how that went.
Well, I think the guy that's setting it up has already said the people who are, I'll say calling in or Wi-Fiing in from their computer, they're not going to be able to actually interact with the other people. It's going to be a one-way, thing, which is too bad. That's one of the nice things about normal Zoom is you can have these two-way conversations, but you're just a spectator. I guess the way ours is going to be set up for Monday.
So it'll be more like a webinar.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Hello, Matthew. Good to see you.
Hi, Dave.
And Katrine is maybe on here. I see a photo of her.
My dinner just became available, so I'm going to try to sneak in a few bites before talking.
I'm here, just wrapping up a work project.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, I'm just gonna wait a couple more minutes. If anyone wants to take this time to introduce themselves, it seems like quite a few of you already know each other. But for those of you that don't know me yet, I'm Paige.
Paige Anderson is our pretty new still executive director, right? Paige, you've only been in position for a few months now, so.
5? Yeah.
Hey, this is Lois Ward, and I thought this sounded like an interesting presentation, so I'm jumping in. Didn't realize it was your team meeting, but anyway, glad to be here, and I know a bunch of you, so I'll go back on mute and enjoy the program.
Well, it's not supposed to be a team meeting. We're hoping for more outside members. We'll see how it turns out.
Hi, Lois. Thanks for joining us. And I am Matthew, the DERT's program coordinator.
And I'm Matt. I'll just go by Matt to keep it simple. Matt Kennelly. I'm assistant executive director at LOTT.
Hi, Matt.
I'm Lisa Dennis Perez, Environmental Planning and Communications Director at LOTT.
Thank you both for joining us tonight. I'm Dave Peeler. I'm one of the board members at the Discharges Estuary Restoration Team.
Are we expecting Sue tonight, Dave?
I think I saw an email that Sue is not going to be able to make it tonight.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm Kevin Hansen, Thurston County's hydrogeologist.
Hey, Kevin, welcome.
Welcome back.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping Sue would be on because she keeps extolling the virtues of that new, high-speed Wi-Fi connection they got at their house, but she keeps having connection problems of one kind or another.
All right, it looks like we'll probably have everyone, and I'll keep grabbing people out of the waiting room as they come in. Go ahead and
Joel Carson.
get started here. Welcome to the Human Water Cycle Part 2. We appreciate you. So this is the second forum in our series. Next month, we are moving on to an EIS series. And so today is the last one about the human water cycle. If you missed part 1, that is totally fine. This one is more unrelated, and we will be going over everything. So here at Discharges Estuary Restoration Team, we're passionate about bringing people together from all walks of life, from all over the watershed and beyond, to celebrate the Deschutes watershed. And what better way to foster this love of the landscape than to meet up here in this space to learn more about water quality issues and what we could do about them. We might be gathering virtually today, but we must always remember that we are on native land. We acknowledge, hold on, I'm sorry, I gotta let people into this. Can I do both? Yes. We acknowledge that this land and water is the traditional territory of the Discharges people of the Squaxin Island tribe. We also thank the Squaxin tribe for their guidance and support of DERT through the years. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to our program coordinator, Matthew.
Thanks, Paige. Do you mind going to the next slide, please?
Yep.
And just a reminder, if people don't mind muting themselves so we can cut down on background noise while speakers are presenting. This is an overview of the agenda tonight. I'm just going to give a brief introduction, and then Sean Dixon from the Puget Soundkeeper Alliance will start off talking a little bit about the Clean Water Act. Then we'll pass it over to Dave Peeler, who will be focusing on nutrient pollution in Puget Sound and the Ecology's nutrient general permit. Kevin Hansen will be talking about on-site septic systems and related topics. And then Matt Kennelly, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, will talk about all the awesome work they're doing at LOTT and some of their visions for improving that wastewater treatment potential in the future. Every speaker is going to have between 15 and 20 minutes, depending on the material that they have to share. And then we're hoping to have about 30 minutes for question and answer, depending on what time we finish up with all the presentations. All right, you can go to the next slide, please, Paige. So this is a two-part human water cycle forum. And the components that we kind of focused on during part one were water withdrawals, focusing on kind of Western water law and physical infrastructure changes to the environment from human development, stormwater runoff and how that's related to impervious surfaces from infrastructure. And today we're focusing specifically on wastewater and some of the stuff related to that, wastewater treatment, nutrient pollution in Puget Sound, which is a big topic right now in Puget Sound. Climate change is an obvious component of the human water cycle. We're not covering that today because we're going to have a whole community forum that is dedicated to climate change down the road. And then part of the human water cycle kind of relates to the laws and policies that govern our relationship with water. One of the reasons we decided to do this community forum is because all of these different components relate to one another and are really important to kind of think of the system holistically, but oftentimes they get siloed into different components and are treated by different agencies. And it's kind of a fragmented approach that has a lot of faults in it. So we think if we kind of inspire a holistic systems view of looking at how water travels over the human landscape and is impacted by the ways that we withdraw water and use it, and then put water back into the environment, that we can have maybe some positive changes to our relationship with water. And that's all I'm going to say, because I want to have as much time as possible for all of our experts who are joining us tonight. So if Sean Dixon is back and available, I'm going to pass it over to Sean from Puget Soundkeeper Alliance.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. Yeah, I did not prepare any slides today, largely because it's 6 o'clock and I think that's about 10 hours I've been on Zoom. And so I just looked at my day and I said, there's zero chance that I want to put another slide deck together and sit there and go over it all with y'all. But the downside of that is I spent about 9 years as a law professor. And so, boy, 15 minutes on the Clean Water Act. That's a near impossibility of an ask, but I'm super glad to be here to chat, especially at the Q&A at the end. I'd love to discuss how and where we go from here and what's going on with the Clean Water Act. But, you know, I would be remiss if I didn't give a little bit of an overview and where things are. And so I will focus on that. And I think, you know, the Clean Water Act as a framework for a lot is a great framework for a lot of the environmentalism going on these days. And I'll, you know, really get to the reason why I think that is, and why that's a difficult and problematic position to be in a few minutes. But largely, to start that, is it's 50 years old. And so a lot of the things that we've got in front of us that we've been working on for 50 years. When the Clean Water Act was passed 50 years ago, and then the president vetoed it, and then it was passed again in October of 1972. We had 60, 70-year-old infrastructure around the country in municipalities that just wasn't functioning. Now, 50 years later, we have 110 to 120-year-old infrastructure that's barely functioning around the country. But that's not to say that the Clean Water Act didn't make a dent in that problem. And to start with that, I think I'll take a step back and walk through the Clean Water Act as I understand it, or as I take away some of the main issues. And really, one of my favorite things that I like to talk about with the Clean Water Act is the parts that people don't understand or don't know about. And it's really divided into 5 or 6 sections, the act itself. A lot of people understand the act because permits, you got to get a permit under the Clean Water Act, or there's water quality standards, if they understand what those are, which, very few of us do, myself included. But the act actually starts off with a whole bunch of other things. But one of the largest by number of sections, parts of the Clean Water Act is the first part. That section sets up a whole host of programs around the country that a lot of people don't necessarily know about. One of the biggest ones that you may not know is set up by that are the National Estuary Programs. So right here in Puget Sound, we have a National Estuary Program that's currently run by the Puget Sound Partnership. But the EPA sits there because it's a National Estuary Program. That was set up by the Clean Water Act. A whole other section of the Clean Water Act was really trying to solve the problems of the day, which were focused on large sewage plants. We had sewage plants all over the country that hadn't been well regulated, were barely primary treatment, needed to go a step up, needed to go to secondary treatment or beyond. And a whole host of the sections of the Clean Water Act were designed to facilitate that transition to better industrial discharges from publicly owned treatment facilities. A third large portion of the Clean Water Act is devoted to this water quality standard setting. So how do we know what a water body should look like? And so in the 1970s, they said, listen, we should be able to figure out, how much pollution a river can handle before it's, shouldn't be used for swimming or eating shellfish out of. But then the policymakers said, well, wait a minute, there's waterways everywhere and there are different uses. And so, I know what we'll do. We'll let the states decide and figure out what's going on there. So enter the system that we have today, where all around the country, in water body segments that are 100 feet long to an entire watershed or an entire bay or estuary, you've got different standards and different uses of different waterways, and sometimes multiple different standards for multiple different uses on the same waterways, both for things that have to do with human health and ecological criteria. So the Clean Water Act created this system that led to an explosion of bureaucracy. Don't mean that pejoratively to the bureaucrats on the line today. Just mean that with love. But there was a ton of work that went into saying, okay, let's look at this, river here. Where do we want people to swim? Where do we want people to be able to shellfish? Where do we want fish to be able to live? I think it's hilarious that there's actual waterways in New York City which has some of the oldest and most outdated ones, the earliest ones set by law, where the water quality use, the use that the state of New York wants for that waterway is for fish to be able to swim through it and be able to breathe for a little bit. Like that is the goal. That is, we want fish to be able to technically be there for a little bit and then get out, not survive, not spawn, certainly not be eaten, just kind of temporarily be. And that's fine under the Clean Water Act. That's a use that you can set. And a state can say that that's, this waterway is so industrial, that's where we want it to be. But then once you figure out what you want to use those waterways for, then you have to do all this work to figure out what that means for pollution. And there's thousands of different things that can affect that. Not all of them are covered by the Clean Water Act. So when you're looking at, say, take a creek and you want to be able to eat the oysters out of it or something like that, or a waterfront, you don't want there to be a lot of arsenic. You don't want there to be a lot of mercury. You don't want there to be a lot of fecal material. But really, what does that mean with respect to water quality standards? And then how do you actually put that into practice to solving the problem? And so, the best science that we had available in the day to study would say, well, listen, we don't want raw sewage inside our oysters. They'll get a sickness or a disease, and that'll get translated to the people eating it. Well, we can really test the waters for fecal coliform that indicates the presence of sewage. And so let's test for that. And so if we have too much fecal coliform, we'll assume that it's in the oysters and people shouldn't eat it. Well, that may be a great idea across the nation, but then in every given waterway, local conditions, the best laid plans get tossed on their head as soon as the first storm comes through. And in that local waterway, in that local section where you just want to set the standards under the Clean Water Act for how we can eat the oysters, you've got tidal fluctuations. You've got non-point source pollution. You might not know where the fecal coliform is coming from. You may have bad things that lead to impairments or water qualities that don't do what they're designed for that come out of the air. What do you do about those? Those have nothing to do with the Clean Water Act. That's the Clean Air Act, maybe. There may be solid waste issues. The problem may be at a Department of Defense facility, which you can't even, approach through the Clean Water Act back in the day. So all of those kind of, how do we even figure out what's going on here? Kind of things start to spiral out of control when you talk about how to actually address them and deal with them. Moreover, there's a ton of waterways all around everywhere in the country. And so how do you monitor and manage and look at all of those things? And 50 years ago, we had modeling. It's nothing new. Dave was there. He probably invented some of it 50 years ago. And so we knew we could plan and we could test and we could survey. But by and large, there's a lot of places that we didn't see what was going on. We didn't have maps. We didn't know how watersheds flowed everywhere. USGS has been at it for 150 years. They know how watersheds work and they know how groundwater flows, but they didn't know about it everywhere. We didn't have remote sensing. We didn't have a lot of the tools that we have today. So the Clean Water Act was really built in a different era, before iPhones, to the younger folks that may be on the line. This is a really big kind of, let's start this clean water revolution and figure out how do we set the standards for our waterways and then figure out what to do about it. That's where we were 50 years ago. Then came the whole permitting program. Thou shalt not pollute without a permit. And that permit needs to say exactly what you're, depending on the waterway you're dumping to, how much you're allowed to dump into it. But even that, whole host of local nuanced complications arise. What if it's a fast moving river that you're dumping into? Or I say dumping, but a lot of people don't like that, discharging into. What if it's a fast moving river? What if it's a coral reef? What if it's a slow moving bay? What if it's a wetland? What if it's not fast moving whatsoever? What if an endangered species lives there? That's a completely different set of legal questions, right? And so all of these things kind of, so we have to have entire teams looking at these facilities, and essentially in order to write the best Clean Water Act permit 50 years ago when we invented the program, you needed to do an entire multiple PhD research project on like the entire ecosystem around every point source and where it was landing, to do a hyper appropriately calibrated discharge permit. And that was really hard to do 50 years ago and 45 years ago and 40 years ago, especially to do that at the thousands of point sources that needed permits. Enter general permits. Here's things that we think generally apply everywhere. And so we have an entire system of new permits that apply to multiple facilities all at once. But over the 50 years, we've really moved in the clean water world, from bigger problems, which we've banged our heads against the wall and done the best we could and tried our hardest and taken our time, and we've had kerfuffles along the way and citizen suits with the citizen suit provision, which you don't have to be a citizen to bring a lawsuit to enforce the Clean Water Act. It says that in the citizen suit provision, which I always found was interesting. Citizen suits. 1, you can sue to enforce the Clean Water Act. 2, you do not need to be a citizen. We mean anybody, really. That's literally what Congress wrote, which I love, so just change it. But anyway, leaving that aside, we've had to bring citizen suits to some people are farther behind than others. But over 50 years, every sewage plant is now at secondary treatment. There's industrial sites, all have permits. Most of the ones that are unpermitted right now aren't ones that escaped jurisdiction. It's somebody new that came onto a site and they didn't get their permit. Like the last person went bankrupt, the permit lapsed, the new person comes into the site, they didn't know to get it, but that site had a permit before. So it's kind of like we're in a secondary growth forest We've had a permit on everything. The Clean Water Act has applied to everything everywhere, at least in a first generation of the Clean Water Act. But what's the second generation of the Clean Water Act? Where do we go from here? And so over that 50 years, we went from having giant, cars dumped into waterways and, factories turning rivers and bays the color of whatever they were painting the materials that day, because it was just a straight outfall. We still have that at Soundkeeper. We do patrols and we still find, a chicken factory will have an illegal discharge connection, and we'll just be going down a waterway, and then there'll be, out of a pipe will come a bunch of feathers and chicken blood, and it freaks us all out. We take photos and we call the state, and it becomes a story for a week. That still happens, but by and large, everybody's, we've gotten all the big things. But the problem is just like the trajectory of environmentalism these days, there's a lot of little things out there too. It's a lot of the subtle things. It's a lot of the bigger picture questions, climate change, how it's changing weather patterns, small chemicals, like what we're doing a lot of work on, as things like the 6-PPD, the chemical in tire that is killing most coho that it comes in contact with before they can spawn. How do we fold those things into these permits? How do we manage land? How do we dovetail land use practices with Clean Water Act practices? 50 years ago, the question was, how do we dovetail Endangered Species Act with the Clean Water Act? And that's really, it's a lot bigger than that. Now we're talking about local ordinances balanced with long-term plans and visions. Moreover, as the folks here that we'll hear from LOTT and others would say is, back in the day, going from primary to secondary, we had lots of space. We weren't space limited. We knew exactly what to do. It's not a particularly difficult question. We could fundraise for it. We had simpler, economic systems back then. Now it's millions and millions of dollars to get that extra mile. The knee of the curve has been something that we talk about now a lot more than we used to, because in order to get that last incremental benefit, it takes a lot more planning, a lot more engineering, a lot more of everything to get that for big things that we did 50 years ago, like sewage. But is that knee of the curve the same for small things that we've never dealt with before, like 6-PPD, that we know that any bioinfiltration medium will take it out of the stormwater that's going through? So just put in a tree pit, funnel your road runoff through there, and Bob's your uncle. And you've taken the pollutant out of the water stream. So, these questions are leading to hugely complex long-term watershed planning crises, because when we as a community came together and said we should be planning at the watershed scale, I thoroughly and totally agree with that. We absolutely should be. But what that problem that arises is that now you're talking about multiple permittees, multiple jurisdictions, people that are working on different timescales, people that have different budgetary needs, people have different demographics in their areas, and they can't fundraise the same with taxes and with fees on the people that live there and the ratepayers. There's a ton of different nuanced aspects of financing that the Clean Water Act wasn't really built to deal with. And so they've turned to the states. There's states that are doing watershed permits. Massachusetts is doing watershed permits on Cape Cod, forcing people to come together with intermunicipal MOUs, applying for a permit together, setting up functional infrastructure investment plans that are approved by the state, and they get a permit for it. How do we deal with these small particles? How do we deal with the microplastics? Nobody really knows how many microplastics. We literally have microplastics in our bloodstream right now because you eat them in all of your food. They're in the water. Every fish eats them. But how much is too much? Remember what I said before is setting those standards. If we want oysters here, we shouldn't have raw sewage. You can test for raw sewage relatively easily. And we've tested over decades how much raw sewage oysters can be around before they shouldn't be eaten. It's not zero, FYI. So if you're eating oysters, they've been in raw sewage. It's a non-zero number, but we've tested for that. So we know where to go. Microplastics, we don't really know. We don't know what that non-zero, we don't know if that's going to lead to cancer clusters. We don't know if that's going to ruin populations. We don't know any of that stuff. And so this is a pollutant entering our waters, impairing uses. And 50 years ago, that's what the Clean Water Act was designed for. And so right now it's a whole bunch of things that are much more complicated, much harder to get out of the system, much more ever present, less tied directly to single solitary polluters that are easy to point at and go after and look at. And so therefore, something that we ask all the time, is the Clean Water Act, how do we use the Clean Water Act to address this new generation of problems and to really wrap our arms around it? And the answer usually is a hybrid of a little bit of everything. So we need some new ideas. We need some state laws to push the envelope. We need private practice and private industry to come up with really cool technologies. We need some folks to go to tertiary treatment just to prove the case. We need some people to put in the best sewage technology to drive the costs down for the rest of us. Thank you, LOTT. We need a whole bunch of everything, all hands on deck, state, federal, local levels, trying to figure out how to best do this. Because once, just like 50 years ago, when the Clean Water Act really got going, when that started getting going, once everyone was putting in secondary treatment, once everyone was getting a permit, once all industrial sites were taking a look at their facilities, once everybody knew that there was an enforcement mechanism, then everybody started trying harder, and this became a matter of course. We need that all over again in this day and age, only we can't wait another 50 years for this. We have, twice as many people in this watershed as we did when the Clean Water Act was passed. I entirely made that number up just now, but it feels right. So, don't quote me on it, but it's something that we definitely don't have the luxury of space or time, given the complexities of climate change, given the burdens on our watersheds and waterfronts, given the declining fish stocks, given that everything is getting warmer and harder to do and more expensive. It's not going to get less expensive moving forward. And so, it's really something that requires us to think outside of the Clean Water Act box to try to address a lot of these Clean Water Act problems. So that's kind of my spiel. And I'm happy to turn it back, but just wanted to, give that, large scale overview of the Clean Water Act and its trajectory over the last 50 years. So I hope that fit the bill.
Thank you, Sean. That was excellent. Definitely learned some new things about the Clean Water Act. And I look forward to the question and answer session so we can learn some more about that. I'm going to pass it over now to Dave Peeler.
Okay, and thanks, Sean. For a lawyer, you did a really good job of not using a lot of legal terms, so very well explained. So I'm going to see if I can find my screen here that I already set up. Why isn't that? We'll go there. Here, go to my PowerPoint. And current slide. Okay. So again, I'm with the Discharge Estuary Restoration Team. Do I have my mute off? You can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Because now I got my screen full of this. So something some people may not realize is that we recently became an affiliate of Puget Soundkeeper Alliance. And thank you, Sean and others, for allowing that to happen. We're very happy with that. And my page down, of course, is not working. Why not? Page down, there we go. So one of the things I like to do remind people of is that because the work we're trying to do in Capitol Lake is pretty intensive, it's a pretty big project, but it was a big project to form Capitol Lake as well. A lot of earth got moved, a lot of big machinery was used, and a lot of action took place. A lot of changes took place at that time back in the 1950s. And that's not showing up for some reason on my screen. One of the things that I wanted to mention, Sean did a great job of going through the Clean Water Act, but one of the things I wanted to mention, and for some reason it is not showing up on my screen here, the first three numbers here, is what's gotten us to the point we're at today with Puget Sound as far as, leading up to this Puget Sound nutrient general permit that Sean mentioned. And some of that is started way back when the Department of Ecology, realized that we were not dealing with nutrient pollution in Puget Sound. And they took it up with the Puget Sound Partnership, which is the state agency, as you probably all know, that is responsible for restoring and protecting Puget Sound at a high level. And they came up with a marine water quality strategy. and an implementation plan for Puget Sound related to marine water quality. And in that marine water quality strategy is an effort to start to identify and deal with nutrient pollution. And then later on, or at roughly the same time, Ecology started several years ago to develop a nutrient reduction plan for Puget Sound. And since Ecology is the one responsible for issuing permits and dealing with non-point pollution primarily, that's kind of what that was going to focus on, was dealing with all the discharges to Puget Sound, the dumpers, as Sean called them a few minutes ago, and also other sources. And so they came up with a nutrient reduction plan. And in that plan was the idea that we're going to have to set a limit for the amount of nitrogen that sewage treatment plants can discharge. And let me just note that when you start looking at where nitrogen in particular comes from, and nitrogen is the biggest nutrient problem in Puget Sound, it mainly comes from sewage treatment plants. And that's because all of us, when we use our bathrooms and toilets and things, and it goes down to the sewage treatment facility, there's a lot of nitrogen in that. And the treatment facilities, unless they're advanced treatment facilities like LOTTs, don't do a particularly good job of removing nitrogen. And so that mainly goes through the treatment plant and, in our case, into Puget Sound. So when Ecology, finished their reduction project plan, the next thing they came up with, of course, was let's issue a general permit to cover these nitrogen discharges. So I want to back up just a second to talk about what the problem is with nitrogen. And one of the things that's interesting is excess nutrients throw off the balance in Puget Sound. And you can think of that like any water body. Sean mentioned other kinds of pollutants, but when you put enough of pollutant in a water body of any kind, it's going to throw off the balance of the ecosystem in that water body. Here we're talking about nitrogen primarily, but nitrogen causes excessive algal growth, and then that algae decomposes. And when it does so, it depletes the oxygen levels in the water. And it also increases carbon dioxide and it acidifies the water as well, both of which, of course, are also exacerbated by climate change. And then in the end, that arrow to the right, that leads to environmental stress on the Puget Sound ecosystem, primarily fish and other critters that need dissolved oxygen in the water to not only pass through it, as Sean was saying, but in order to thrive, in order to reproduce and make sure that we have the fish into the future. So if we look at a slide, and I've showed this before, when the Department of Ecology did a study on the depletion of dissolved oxygen in Bud Inlet, and one of the things that they found, a couple of significant points really on this slide, is you'll notice this is a bar chart of the causes of the depletion of dissolved oxygen in Bud Inlet. The biggest cause they identified was all the effects associated with Cap Lake Dam, and that's a pretty large effect there. But you'll notice that the second largest cause was external pollution, external to Bud Inlet, i.e. pollution getting into Puget Sound and then ending up in Bud Inlet from non-point sources and wastewater treatment plants to the north of us. And then you have non-point pollution in Bud Inlet. And then finally, the next bar there is wastewater treatment plants that actually discharge directly into Bud Inlet. And that turns out to be, the smallest bar of the bunch. So this, as you might imagine, this caused quite a bit of consternation when you start thinking that it's actually a big significant factor here is external pollution into Bud Inlet. And to give you a sense of why that might be the case, when you look at where treatment plants are all around Puget Sound, there's a lot of them. There's about 80 treatment plants in the Puget Sound basin, and about, I can't remember the exact number, but around 60 of those discharge directly into Puget Sound. And then the remainder of them are generally, some distance upstream on the tributary rivers. Say, the city of Puyallup discharges to the Puyallup River, so many miles upstream, but eventually that pollution reaches Puget Sound. So 80 Puget Sound treatment plants, sewage treatment plants in the basin. And according to the Department of Ecology, their annual discharge of all those put together is about 26 million pounds of nitrogen entering into Puget Sound. That seems like a lot. And when you divide that on the average, into pounds per day, it's about 70,000 pounds. And that means, 10 to 15 dump truck loads of dumping nitrogen directly into Puget Sound every single day, every day of the year for years on end. That's got to have an effect. And when you look at where those sources are in bud inlets, as I said, you see LOTT here at 284 pounds per day on the average. And then there's a few tiny treatment plants in addition to LOTT, Tamashan, Carline Beach, Boston Harbor. I think there might be one missing here. And you can see their numbers are down below 10. They're pretty darn small in comparison to LOTT. And LOTT, believe it or not, is not very big. So I put this chart together to sort of compare LOTT to other treatment plants really to the north of us. So when I didn't list all the treatment plants because I don't have room on one slide to show 80 treatment plants. But when you look at the treatment plants kind of going from south towards the north, backwards, as you would see on a map, you see there's a few other ones that are small right off the bat, Gig Harbor, Shelton. But then look at Fort Lewis, a federally regulated treatment plant, 423 pounds per day. So quite a bit larger than LOTT. And then you get into the big municipal treatment plants in Pierce County. So Pierce County, Chambers Creek, Tacoma Central, et cetera, thousands of pounds per day. And then finally, when you get up to King County, a little farther on the list here, you're up in the tens of thousands per day in individual plants. And King County has 4 treatment plants, all of which are quite large. And I stopped around Everett, but you can get a sense here when you compare LOTT's numbers here, 284 pounds to some of these other plants. I mean, it's really very, very tiny in comparison to those plants discharging at their locations. Now, I don't mean to imply that all of that pollution reaches Bud Inlet because it doesn't, but some of it does. And this was a headline, actually, I think, from Christopher Dunnigan in Encyclopedic Sound a couple of years ago. And he just said, a regional sewage treatment system in Thurston County has helped to decrease oxygen problems in Bud Inlet as the population continues to grow. And that's also one of the things here is as population grows, currently, the way the system is set up, other than LOTT, most of these treatment plants do not have a limit on the amount of nitrogen they can discharge. So for every additional home or apartment house or industry they connect to their sewage system, they're going to be putting more nitrogen into the waters of Puget Sound. That's just the way it goes right now. LOTT, on the other hand, is a very advanced plant and has been working with limits down here for some time. Here's another way of comparing LOTT, and I hope I'm not stepping on Matt or Lisa's information here, but again, at 284 pounds per day, but they're also, this is their average discharge is 12 millions of gallons per day. And I just looked at small plants that are, either smaller or slightly larger than LOTT. But look at, say, Edmonds, which is actually quite a bit smaller, 7 MGD, but discharges twice as much pollution, nitrogen pollution. And if you look at Bremerton, which is slightly smaller, and they're 4 times higher, maybe more in nitrogen pollution. So that gives you a sense of how good job LOTT is really doing at reducing nitrogen with their sewage treatment plant compared to those that really have never had to do that. So there's no limit on the nitrogen discharge from these other plants. And to give you a sense of, this is what we see when you go out around Puget Sound now in the summertime and the algae is blooming all over the place. And I have photos that are actually much worse than these taken from the air by the Department of Ecology. And huge swaths of Puget Sound will be covered with algae blooms now. That never happened in the past. And we're starting to look a lot more like the Florida coast or Chesapeake Bay, unfortunately, because of these algal blooms. So Ecology decided they were going to issue a general permit to cover nitrogen from all the treatment plants in the Puget Sound Basin that discharge to Puget Sound. So the initial permit they issued, by the way, was issued in early December of last year, 2021, and it was appealed by the end of December by many outfits, and I'll talk about those in a minute. That permit does not apply to tribally owned or federally owned sewage treatment plants because those are regulated by EPA. So think about JBLM, Fort Lewis, and so on. Or there's a couple of tribes, obviously, that have their own treatment plants to serve their casino and hotel populations. It also does not apply to any treatment plants that are discharged into the upstream in the rivers, as I mentioned earlier. Those are meant to be added later after Ecology's done some more evaluation of how much of that pollution actually enters into Puget Sound by the time it enters there, downstream. And then some of the requirements in the permit are the initial requirements are that the discharges are supposed to monitor and report on their nitrogen discharges especially exceedances of something new called an action level. Now, one of the interesting things here is in the past, they never even monitored for nitrogen. This only started a couple of years ago when Ecology actually issued orders to the treatment plants to begin doing some quarterly monitoring of treatment plants. So their permits didn't even include a limit for nitrogen, and they didn't have to monitor. So when Sean talked about permits earlier on, the permits issued, covered, these large treatment plants, but didn't really establish limits on every conceivable contaminant that might be in that discharge, and including nitrogen in this case. One of the other elements of that new permit is to require the treatment plants to implement a nitrogen optimization plan and to evaluate strategies for maximizing nitrogen removal. This was really meant to be, what can you do in a short term in order to remove some excess nitrogen from your treatment plant? We've had success with a similar approach in some other freshwater watersheds, notably in Spokane, but in other places as well, when sometimes treatment plants, because they've never had to worry about a particular type of pollutant, if you ask them to look at it, they might find some relatively inexpensive and easily attained ways to start to lower that pollutant, because they've never looked at it before, they don't really know. So that was the intent of that particular requirement. They're also required to conduct a nutrient reduction evaluation, which includes planning for future facility upgrades and future treatment in order to address the nitrogen loads. And it established a 15-year compliance schedule to accomplish all of this. Let's see, that's the website for the Pollution Control Hearings Board. So as I said, the permit was appealed, and I've forgotten the number, but I think it was 8 different sewage treatment plant owners, i.e. cities and sewage districts. And also, thank you, Sean, Puget Soundkeeper Alliance and Washington Environmental Council and the Suquamish Tribe were also appellants on sort of the let's make sure this permit is strong side, as opposed to let's make sure this permit never goes into effect side by the dischargers. So I'm not a lawyer, but I did look through several of the appeals. And so I tried to put it in non-legal terms, what I saw in the appeals, but also what we'd been hearing from some of the dischargers just before the permit was issued. So on the top of this slide are some of the claims of the dischargers. And, they claim it's not supported by science, that they are not causing or contributing to water quality standards violations. And that phrase, causing or contributing to violations, is straight out of the Clean Water Act. So that's an important point to be able to prove if you're the Department of Ecology, or disprove if you're a discharger. They also would like to see the water quality standards for dissolved oxygen revised before any new permits are put in place. They think the computer model that Ecology used, which is the Salish Sea ecosystem model, has too much uncertainty in it and should be revised further. They claimed it's not legal to use a general permit when they're already covered by an individual permit. So that's a tricky point, because as Sean indicated, every one of these dischargers is discharging under a legally issued individual permit. So every one of them, the 80 of them, all have a permit from the Department of Ecology. The general permit seeks to be an overlay on top of that, specifically related to nitrogen. So the idea was, we're not going to mess with their individual permit, but we will add an overlay on top that tells them what they need to do in order to reduce their nitrogen discharge. So that's been appealed. And they claim that the permit itself is internally inconsistent, and that the action levels are incorrectly calculated and the required reductions have no factual basis. That part is a direct quote from the appeals. Earlier, when we were discussing this with Ecology over the last couple of years, some of their other statements were that the treatment technology available is either not available or it's unproven. And of course, we know that's not really true, because there are other areas in the United States where treatment is being used already in similar situations. Also, as Sean indicated, there are occasions when the site conditions are very difficult for adding new treatment technology. And a case in point would be like the West Point treatment plant in Seattle, where there's really not a lot of room because they've expanded that plant so many times. There's not much more room down there to work with. Their third point is it's just too costly, that it's going to cause utility rates to be too high for some of their customers, and not enough time, 15 years, is allowed for compliance. And in some cases, the claims are that other watershed-based efforts would be more effective, i.e. doing habitat restoration or doing some non-point source pollution controls. And then finally, that discharge limits could cause limits to growth, which in fact they could if discharges were not taking steps to actively treat and remove this pollutant from their discharge. The primary points of the environmental and tribal appeals were the Federal Clean Water Act requires reduction of human-caused nutrients. So it's not like Ecology can decide to avoid this. It's a requirement if water quality standards are not being met. And also the permit as issued does not meet all the Clean Water Act requirements in some respects. We thought the compliance timelines of 15 years are actually too long. And the statistical approach that they use to calculate the action levels actually favors in discharges rather than the environment, i.e. the risk is more on the environment than on the discharges. And we think that sewage treatment plants should start planning now to add nutrient removal technology and not be waiting around for 5 or 10 years for that to happen. There should be more incentives to bring about timely compliance, and equitability is an issue of concern between small and large sewage treatment plants. And you saw on my chart the huge difference between some small discharges, even much smaller than LOTT in many cases, and on the really huge ones like up in King County, which are I think there's only five or seven discharges, I forget the number, are responsible for something like 70% of the pollution in Puget Sound. So you can see that the big discharges have they have a huge difference in Puget Sound. And then, so they should have more stringent requirements. I mean, that's the claim here. And then nutrient removal technology is available and is already successfully installed across the country, including other estuaries. So it's not like it's unknown technology. It is known. And the response by the state legislature, which was a worry for us as this was issued in December, the legislature, started their session in January of this year. We were worried that there might be bills that would, somehow affect this permit, but really that didn't happen. There were a couple of bills introduced that didn't go anywhere. But what did happen was that the legislature did make some money available for these Puget Sound nutrient reduction grants program for sewage treatment plants, so they could do some planning and evaluation as required by the general permit. And there was $9 million made available for this year for those sewage treatment plants. And 41 of the 43 eligible applicants did apply for funding from that $9 million. So it's probably not going to go very far, but they did get at least that amount of money. In addition, it doesn't show up on the screen, I don't know why, but there's a lot of money available for construction. So the state of Washington, their 2023 fiscal year 2023 grants and loans funding list, which is already available. It's a draft list at this point, will become final at the end of May for the next fiscal year, which starts July 1st, includes, I'm trying to remember, about $365 million in grants and loans for not just sewage treatment plants, but for different kinds of habitat restoration and non-point source control facilities, et cetera, and stormwater facilities as well. Most of that actually, the largest percentage of that goes to sewage treatment plants. Now, it's a combination of grants and loans, and this is a state program that's been in existence since 1988. So part of that is the federally capitalized SRF loans are called for wastewater facilities, et cetera. And then part of it is what's called the Centennial Clean Water Fund, which is grants, funded by the legislature. Now unfortunately, the grants are, run about $50 million per biennium, whereas the loans can run, as I just said, $360 million. So there's a big difference between getting loans versus grants, but also some of those loans can be made available at no interest for small communities that just wouldn't have the funds to repay a loan with interest. And they can also, some of them can be forgivable. So about $15 million of the planning for this next round are in so-called forgivable loans, which means they wouldn't have to pay them back. So, I mean, there are ways to help out here. Now, none of the money in that particular grant list is specifically allocated towards achieving these nutrient reductions. So this permit came out after most of the work on that funding cycle had already been completed. So we might see some effort to get additional funds directly related to the nutrient reduction program. So the appeals are, have been filed. And Sean can feel free maybe to kick in later if you have some other thoughts on the appeal situation. But the appeals to permits issued by Ecology are made to the State Pollution Control Hearings Board, which is actually here in Olympia. And they establish hearing dates on those appeals. And right now, the hearing date established, I think, is a week in December of 2022. So it's a ways away yet, about 8 months away. And what we heard from the discharges is they think they're going to need about 4 weeks just for their side of the case. So I'm not sure how that's playing out right now to PCHB, but it sounds like they're going to need more than the time that the PCHB has set aside. Now PCHB hears, tons of cases. So it's almost like a court where they have to set aside time ahead of time, and they try to estimate how much time will be needed for each court case, and then they schedule their time. And so if a lot more time is going to be needed, that might push the appeal out, or they might have to drop some other cases off the agenda for a while. So looking ahead, kind of where do we go from here? DERT, as I said, we're not an appellant on this, but our affiliate, Puget Soundkeeper Alliance, is. And we will continue to work with our allies at the Alliance and at WC and the tribes to push for the best possible outcomes in the PCHB decision and any subsequent permit revisions or subsequent appeals that might happen from the PCHB decision. And we'll continue to press for strong ecology permit conditions and shorter timelines for compliance. But we will support efforts to obtain state and federal matching grants and loans to offset a portion of the local costs for treatment plant upgrades. And there is no doubt that these treatment plant upgrades will be really high. I mean, we're talking $1 billion or more state, region wide. So it's a lot of money. On the other hand, one of the things I keep telling myself is, 20 years ago, I would never have thought we'd have so many brand new sports facilities in downtown Seattle at the cost of billions of dollars. So the cost for these upgrades is probably less than the cost that it was just spent in the last decade or two on sports facilities in the city of Seattle. So I think we can make it happen, is why I'd say that. It could happen. And we will also not accept delays in other programs such as stormwater controls, habitat protection, restoration, et cetera. All of these are needed to achieve water quality standards and protect public health, fish, and wildlife. Yet part of the claim that we hear from local governments especially is that, well, they can't really do this because they're required to spend their money on stormwater upgrades. And yes, they are. But the Clean Water Act doesn't actually allow for discharges to decide they're going to only do some of the work that's required by the Clean Water Act and not do other work. It actually makes them do all of it. So part of our challenge will be, and part of Sean's challenge, I think, in WEC, is to work with discharges to make sure that they are making progress at all these fronts, but make sure that the timelines are acceptable and can be worked. And I think that might have been, my last slide really. And we just end with South Sound needs flourishing estuaries. And on the left is the Nisqually estuary, and on the right is Capitol Lake. So, I thought these were pretty nice contrasting photos. Nisqually estuary has been rehabilitated, as you are probably all aware, at a pretty high cost a few years ago, and it's been very, very successful. And we like to see the same thing happen here in the Deschutes estuary. But in order for the Deschutes estuary to be healthy and vibrant, we're going to have to make these other investments and in order to control nitrogen discharges throughout Puget Sound and not just here in our local estuary and in Bud Inlet. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dave. And I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Hansen.
I got to stop screen sharing somehow.
Thank you, Dave.
Okay, hi, everybody. Let me try to grab screen here.
I think Dave is still sharing.
Am I? I don't. Okay, I'm looking.
It may ask to allow.
There you go.
There you are.
Or
Okay. So thanks for having me. I'm
welcome
Kevin
back.
Hansen. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Thurston County's hydrogeologist, so I've got gobs and gobs of data here, and I'm going to try to condense it down to something which can be cogently displayed in 20 minutes or so, and then leave it to questions. Folks have already talked about a number of important issues, and I guess what I'm about to say is sort of tangential to that. Let me come over here and just make sure I can shift slides. Yeah, for me, it's about data, not politics. I'm not going to talk about policy, just about what the facts are as we know them. I'll come back to a slide I showed last time, which is the growth forecast for Thurston County. You know, a 42% projected population increase. It's enormous. Now, one has to ask the question, is this a chicken and egg problem here? In other words, if we expect it, will we plan for it, and therefore it will come? I'd say that this is not much of a deflection from historic growth in our area. Our area is extremely popular. It's grown like crazy. And I think, you know, TRPC's estimate is, you know, pretty close if it's not spot on. So if we look at where that's going to go, the dividing line is essentially 50-50 between the cities and the UGA/rural county. It is biased heavily towards more densely populated areas. That's as the Growth Management Act desired. In other words, it's more compact than it probably would have been in the past. But we've got wastewater being generated in both areas. So I want to start with a map of the county and show you the great areas that are the cities, and start off with a partial look. These are just blob lines that I put on for some of the sewer systems. City of Yelm is not shown, Tamishan and Grand Boston Harbor are not shown, and there's a little system up at Steamboat Island, the Carland system, which is a truck-mounted system, actually a non-pipe system. Is very interesting. So aside from some smaller systems, this is the only part of the county. These are the only parts of the county that really receive major wastewater service. And even within them, there are lots and lots of septic systems. So the thing I want to start off with is the main treatment process of the Bud Inlet treatment plant operated by LOTT. LOTT does a terrific job. They're, as we've just seen, head and shoulders above a lot of the treatment facilities in our area, and they even go a step further. But I want to, before going on, I just want to show you some of the dischargers. So these are the approximately scaled circles representing the locations of approximate locations of wastewater discharge. These are the ecology permitted discharges, and you got to understand that wastewater is permitted by many different entities. So Thurston County permits certain wastewater systems. State Department of Health regulates large on-site septic systems. Ecology obviously issues discharge permits for both surface water and to groundwater. The tribes issue separate discharge permits. And there's one other I'm forgetting, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So you notice all the tribal casinos are pretty sizable wastewater systems. Grand Mound, you know, unincorporated areas. Cook Seafood has a large discharge permit down around this area. We noticed Nisqually Trout Farm also has a large discharge going into Henderson Inlet. And then, you know, we think of sewers and we think of discharges as primarily human wastewater, but that's not entirely true. We've got industrial and commercial dischargers that are also pretty darn sizable. We've even got things like the Cedar Creek Correction Center way up in the hills, and we've got Miller Sylvania State Park, which goes to groundwater, and that receives septic from RVs and campers, and we've got City of Tenino that discharges directly to groundwater. Very strict permit, by the way, too. So that said, the next step that LOTT goes to that I'm a huge fan of and have been participating in the study of has been the production of reclaimed water. So reclaimed water happens at two main facilities right now. The Bud Inlet plant produces reclaimed water, and a lot of it, it's distributed to multiple customers, and a lot of it goes back up the hill to Tumwater, where it goes onto the golf course now. I believe that's actually in operation now. The LOTT Martin Way plant produces reclaimed water, I think a majority of which goes up to the Hawks Prairie area, where maybe a little over 1 million gallons a day goes into a groundwater recharge system. Now, This is scheduled for expansion. And I want to tell you a funny story, because Thurston County approached LOTT and said, you know, we'd like some of this reclaimed water to offset, per the Hearst decision and the subsequent laws following it, to offset residential growth dependent upon permit exempt wells. And the cities quite firmly said that they were against that because they had already committed to Ecology to use the reclaimed water and the future potential for growth in reclaimed water for use in offsetting water rights. In other words, LOTT was essentially working with the cities to commit to fulfilling water rights permits. We're withdrawing water. Reclaimed water is in part recharging the aquifer. So where that's happening, for example, is the Lacey Park right here by, I think, is it Goose Pond? I forget the name of the pond here, but by the Lacey City Park, there's a very large groundwater recharge facility that receives, in the summertime at least, quite a bit of reclaimed water. And that's scheduled to expand. The city of Lacey is also, maybe some of the other cities also, have started to install purple pipe. You know, the purple pipe is the nickname for reclaimed water. It's used throughout the West. It's a very popular solution, although it's rather new in our area. But Lacey's been asking people and planning in its projects to install purple pipe. So we've got these pipes that are waiting to receive water when the time is right. And the hope is that projects will step forward to receive it. So all indications are that reclaimed water is in a growth spurt right now, and we expect that to continue. But bear in mind, the cost of reclaimed water is extremely high. And that's why I show this diagram. This is the schematic of the Martin Way reclaimed water plant. And boy, this is really, you know, this is a trick to operate. It is extremely complex, very expensive to operate. And LOTT does a great job at it. Got lots of data to demonstrate that. But it takes energy. You know, we're pumping it uphill to Hawks Prairie. We've got to focus on this and really make it expand and grow in order to make reclaimed water work. So it's both a success story and a cautionary note that essentially all paths forward have pretty darn high costs. But the good news is that we're pulling water out of the discharge that would otherwise have gone in to Butt Inlet. So it's reducing the loading to Butt Inlet, which is a good thing. So by comparison, this is the simplest possible septic system schematic cutaway. Now, look what happens in a septic system. It really just exits the home, enters this tank, and this is a double tank system, very common. There are systems that are more complex than this. The effluent comes out using nitrate as the indicator at about 60 milligrams per liter, although it can be much higher, several hundred, and it also can be much lower. But this system is only really designed to handle fecal coliform mostly and denitrification mostly. It is not designed and does not do much in the way of removal for more exotic substances and consumer products. And therein lies a real pitfall. And I'm very concerned about that. And we'll look in a minute at what some of the consequences of that might be. So if you look at the removal efficiency of a septic system, you know, you're looking at 90 to 98% removal of the substances, which in toto we would refer to as BOD, which are essentially bioactive processes. They're oxygen demanding processes that deplete oxygen. Septics are pretty good at removing there. Nitrogen removal is okay. Phosphorus removal is not bad. Fecal coliform removal is pretty good, and that's where they're strongest. Nothing on this chart, however, talks about consumer products or pharmaceuticals or the broad range of risk-driving substances that LOTT is aggressively attempting to treat. So let's look at the consequence of that. So if I sample groundwater, and this list comes from the Hawks Prairie study, the reclaimed water infiltration study. I asked the team for, you know, what are the substances we're likely to find in groundwater, and this is the list they gave me, and I added a couple here that are not from them. About 60 milligrams nitrate comes out of a typical septic system, some fecal coliform, and then this long list. Acesulfame K is a sweetener. Sucralose. I don't see it on here, but caffeine is frequently detected. These substances, in many cases, are very durable. They travel a long, long way. They're not removed very well by septic systems. And in fact, many other treatment processes have a hard time with some of these substances. It's a real problem, an emerging problem that we're only beginning to get the tip of. LOTT, to its credit, has aggressively sought to find out what the facts are about this. And I think this is something that, for me, raises a red flag, not about LOTT's work, but about septic systems and how we're going to handle these kinds of substances in the very difficult arena of, every single home in Thurston County that's in rural areas, not connected to a sewage treatment plant, is having to deal with these things, but is unprepared for that. So how widespread is septic system usage? I think there was a question about this. At current count, we've got more than 57,000 septic and OSS systems in Thurston County. We did an analysis of them by estimated wastewater loading rate, and it's about 50-50 in terms of the amount of wastewater going to treatment plants versus rural septics. About half goes to each in terms of total water. However, as I just said, the septic systems do a much worse job at treatment for many of the substances that we're beginning to understand are of concern. Now, parcel size varies, soil capacity varies, system size varies. How do we compare and find where the real problems are? That's what we've spent the last year working on. This is wastewater loading. Now, wastewater loading is a formula, and this is estimated, calculated based on what we know of the concentration of effluent and the volume of effluent. And loading, as appears in the phrase total maximum daily load, is a much more scientifically rigorous way of looking at what's going into a water body. So I'd urge people not to focus on concentration, but as much as loading. Now, that the granularity of the map I'm showing here is a little bit hard to read. Let me zoom in and we'll look at something. This is Lacey, piece of Tumwater, piece of Olympia, centered mostly around the Tri-Lakes area. Now, the bright red areas are septic systems at a density, sometimes many systems per acre, that would vastly exceed anything that we permit today. But they're legacy systems in which the cumulative loading of wastewater exceeds, from the moment it's created, the Safe Drinking Water Act criteria of 10 milligrams per liter. So you can't drink this stuff, we don't think, on average. Anywhere it's shown as red, obviously there are lots and lots and lots of nuances to the details of hydrogeology out here that would make individual sampling different. But we're checking. We got a grant from the State Department of Health, and we're sampling wells throughout this area, attempting to find out what the effects of this septic density have been. Remembering that Thurston County only requires one sample at the time a well is installed, and most of them never again. Wells that are Group B systems, small community systems, are sampled at a slightly greater frequency, but again, for a very short list of coliform or nitrate parameters. The Group A systems, the big systems, the city systems, are sampled much more frequently, and we have a much better handle. And they're also much deeper wells. The problem is that a lot of the older wells are also shallow. The shallow wells are more exposed to surface septage. That's the genesis of the grant. We did modeling to try to find out, how big a problem is this, because these are the wells in that same area. So let me go back and forth. There's the potential septic loading, and here are the public supply wells mostly, and a few permit exempt wells, domestic wells, Group B systems. There are quite a few in here. So we're going through and sampling them. We'll try to hit about 60 of them according to the grant. We'll also sample for consumer products, pharmaceuticals. Well, hold it, let me back up. We're going to sample for indicators of human wastewater impact. So we're actually going to analyze for sweeteners and caffeine. in those samples. We believe that those are a non-pejorative way of establishing whether or not someone's well has been impacted by wastewater without really causing a huge problem for the landowners in telling them that they have something that might be a real risk driver. We're trying to, that's always one of the problems. People are scared to find out what's in their water supplies. And it affects every aspect of any kind of technical determination. They do not want regulators to step in and tell them what to do. They know the costs can be enormous and it affects the value of their property and holdings. So it's a tricky thing and we try to handle it with a soft approach. And so analyzing for indicators has been the norm for a long time. Note that we always talk about nitrate. Nitrate's not very toxic, but it's easy to analyze for. It's a cheap analyte, and we use it as an indicator. So I'd urge everyone, do not get focused on nitrate alone. The spectrum of chemistry which results in risk can be very different from the nitrate. The nitrate is often not the risk driver. So Dave, my question to you, you'll see in the chat box was, are any of the wastewater dischargers looking at substances other than nitrate, which I think is very important. I want to try to come back to it. So let me show you. I'm going to switch screens again. I'm going to stop this share and begin a new screen share of this. Okay, this is a model. Anybody on microphone live tell me if they can see this thing?
I can see it.
Okay, good. So this is a model representation of part of what you just saw. So down here on the right, this blue polygon is the north end of Long Lake. This is the north end of Hicks Lake. This is Chambers Lake, eastern and western branches. And the stream running up through the center is Woodland Creek. So this is the heart of the high density septics. And if I hit play, let's cross our fingers, it begins to play. You should see a yellow expanding plume with orange blobs. Okay, looks like it's stalling a little bit at my end. I hope it comes through at your end. So the 10s that you see are places where the concentration in the second aquifer down, an important drinking aquifer in our area, has already reached a concentration above the Safe Drinking Water Act, at or above the Safe Drinking Water Act. Federal MCL, 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate. Not good stuff. And so if I stop that share, I can show you one other example of that. This is the sort of science we're doing in order to try to figure out how big a problem these all are, these septic systems. So if I play this one, this is southern Thurston County, the southwest corner of the county, the area, the district between Tenino on the far right, Grand Mound near the center, and Rochester on the left center. And this was a much faster moving plume. This one is in a very, very porous permeable gravel. And a couple things. First of all, the plume moves much more quickly in groundwater. Secondly, it's not as highly concentrated. This is more yellow colors, which are below 10. It's not great. Most of these wells will have nitrate detectable in them, but at concentrations below the federal MCL. Now, is that good or bad? Well, I think that deserves more scrutiny. So, all right, try to finish up here. Here we go. I've got two report cards to share with respect to drinking water. The high growth to me is the salient factor. Drinking water is already under pressure. Groundwater quality is okay with significant exceptions, and shallow groundwater is undrinkable in many areas. I should have said in northern Thurston County and some other places, but primarily in northern Thurston County. And I just want to put in a disclaimer. This is my technical opinion, not a county policy. Report card, I say number 3 because I'm counting the report card from last show I gave here. But for surface water, Deschutes Estuary and Butt Inlet are already under pressure, obviously. Improved wastewater quality is very costly. All treatment methods have residual wastewater chemicals. Wastewater hotspots are mostly at legacy wastewater systems, and newer regulations are stricter. So, I mean, some of these are just dead obvious, but needed to be said anyway. I mean, it's easy to miss what's the what about these things. And I will pause there and turn it back over to the hosts. Thank you very much.
Thanks once again, Kevin, for all that amazing information. Wonderful graphics. All right, and our last speaker for tonight before we do a question and answers session is Matt from LOTT.
Thanks. It was a great introduction for all the LOTT talk and provides some good context to what I'll show you here tonight. Oh, let's go ahead. Can you see? Hold on one second. Let me reshare that screen. That's showing up okay? Okay, great. So yeah, I'm Matt Kennelly, Assistant Executive Director at LOTT, and Lisa Dennis Perez here, our Environmental Planning and Communications Director, is available for some questions here at the end. Just to jump right in on what we do at LOTT for nutrient removal. Just as a reminder, for those of you just unfamiliar, this is what we are at LOTT with LOTT. It's Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, and Thurston County, and we're the regional wastewater utility here in our community. We're actually a nonprofit corporation founded in 1976. So the entities got together and decided to do this wholesale wastewater treatment. At the time, Olympia was doing it, and there was a contract with Olympia for a while, and then LOTT became what you see today. In around 2000, 2005, the employees came over. So this population served, the Seward population, building on what Kevin said, is 116,000. That's about how many people. Our main plant is down at the Butt Inlet treatment plant, where we average, as you heard earlier tonight, 12 million gallons per day. But because we have combined sewers in downtown Olympia, that's stormwater and wastewater, so those high rains come through as they did recently, and they have been, we can peak over 65 million gallons per day. So the operation of a treatment plant like that requires a lot of training, staff, notice, folks being on call when we see weather changing, and we're built to handle it. So we can handle it well. And we haven't had a combined sewer overflow for weather related or anything else in about 14 years. So we treat to advanced secondary standards. We discharge. There's a diffuser pipe out into Butt Inlet to the north here in this image, and we produce about 1.5 million gallons of reclaimed water at this facility and at the Martin Way facility, as Kevin mentioned. The plant itself was built by Olympia in 1951 for about $500,000 in cost at that time. And just doing the basics at the time, settling and some grit removal and sending it out into Butt Inlet. In 1983 is when it really got that big upgrade you heard about in the context of the Clean Water Act. So $67 million in 1983 dollars, where aeration was added in order to remove that biochemical oxygen demand, clarification and digestion were upgraded. So that represents about a 93% reduction in BOD at that time in the permit. And then came 1994, where the plant that you see it today really got its big boost to nutrient removal, what we've been talking about with construction of a new basin and conversion of some old basins, converting to UV disinfection, which is a lot better than using chlorine because of disinfection byproducts as it goes out into Butt Inlet. And you can kind of get a sense of this image. We talk about room to build, right? And as the peninsula was getting filled in, there was room at the time and funding and different contexts at the time. So that represented the nutrient removal portion of that was $29 million at that time in the early 90s. So to show you the steps that we treat in wastewater, and for some of you, this might be fairly basic, but others, it would be useful. And it's a video that we put together. It's only a few minutes long that I'd like to play here tonight. and actually won an award. Lisa and her group put this together with some outsourcing there, and it just really does a better job than me speaking to the details. So I'll play that here.
Just how do we clean the water that comes to the Bud Inlet treatment plant in Olympia? Well, here's the process in a nutshell. First, the dirty water arrives via a large underground 5-foot diameter influent pipe. Step 1, our headworks, where we take out the trash. Headworks, that is where we remove all the garbage from the wastewater. The incoming water runs like a river through big screens that filter out the trash, which then gets sent to the landfill. After we screen out the trash, the water flows through the grit chamber, where we get the smaller, heavier items out, aka the grit. Things like coffee grounds, eggshell bits, and dirt sink to the bottom of the chamber. Under the floor in this giant room is step 2 of the treatment process, known as the primary clarifiers. In the primary clarifiers, the water slows down and more waste settles out. The lighter stuff, the stuff that floats, are the fats, oil, and grease, called fog for short. The heavy material, yes, that's the poop, though we call it sludge at this point, will sink to the bottom. Long panels skim the bottom and top of the basins to remove the sludge and fog. Time for step 3. The next step in LOTT's wastewater treatment is the biological process. In this step, we use 60,000 to 70,000 pounds of microbes that work at the plant around the clock to help clean the water. In these basins, we mimic nature by using bacteria to break down the waste and gobble up the nutrients. It is especially critical that we remove the nutrients from the water, especially nitrogen, which comes from human waste, food, and some soaps and detergents. If excess nutrients are released into Puget Sound, it can cause algae blooms. Then, when the algae die and decompose, the oxygen becomes depleted in the water, which can cause other aquatic plants and animals to die. That's why this biological treatment step is so important. Step 4, the secondary clarifiers. In these secondary clarifiers, we let the water be still again. Here, the bacteria clump together and sink, helping pull other suspended particles out of the water. These bacteria are collected, and some are sent back to the treatment process to be reused. Step 5. LOTT uses ultraviolet UV light for disinfection. The ultraviolet light deactivates any bacteria or pathogens left in the water. Here you have it, the treated wastewater called final effluent that is ready to be released into Puget Sound. What you sent us when you flushed the toilet or drained the sink arrived here looking like this, and now leaves like this. This water has been treated to advanced secondary standards, the highest level of treatment currently provided at any wastewater treatment plant along Puget Sound. That's the process that protects our waters that takes place 24 hours a day, 365 days a year at the LOTT Bud Inlet Treatment Plant.
So we like showing that video. Usually it's over lunch when people are eating, and then there's poop talk and lots of jokes from that. And so to answer the question in the chat, the microbes and bacteria, it's self-sustaining in the sense that our operators are like bacteria farmers, and they're just, keeping everything in very, very tight control. Let me just go ahead and go back to the presentation, walk you through the next step. So that's kind of at a high level, but down to the numbers here for what our permit says. And this is the concentration values. The 3 is the total inorganic nitrogen at times when it's not the higher rain winter times, November to March. We have a ammonia nitrogen limit currently for nitrogen during that time. But you can see the pounds per day limits, and we operate under those. But this gives you a sense of where our current permit is. And then, so building on the 1994 upgrade, and think about it, it's almost 30 years old, 30 years that we've been doing this and learned a lot over time. So we're on our second generation upgrade of our nutrient removal right now. And our first phase is fully operation. We're operating our new mode. We're getting numbers that we've never had achieved in the history of LOTT as far as the low nitrogen values, even lower than we were before. So we're very excited. And also because we had some opportunity here to combine some tankage, improve some control and flexibility, have some energy savings as well, over 20% plant-wide energy savings by using the latest technology and reducing some major pumping that was occurring between these two basins. And so you think about us spending $1 million to $1.5 million every year on energy, and even the carbon impact of that. So 20% plant energy savings was big and helped make a business case to invest in this kind of thing as well, in addition to the capacity and nutrient benefits and the other qualitative aspects in our community. So lessons learned that we've had over time with nutrient removal that we're sharing with our peers is it's certainly possible. It can be challenging because we're operating at very, very low levels and it's expensive. As we talked about tonight, the cost of just this upgrade itself, that was $29 million, but just that we already had the tanks in place. So the external factors themselves, whether or not we get a slug load of pollutants coming down that we weren't aware of, that impacts our biology, storm events that cause high flows. Sometimes we need to shut down the plant at night in low flow conditions and do some upgrades, and the biology is stressed, so it takes a little bit to come back from that. So the external factors are really important. And with those stringent permit limits that we have, there's just little room for those pressures. So we've built in a lot of controls to try to ride out those peaks of issues. But we have a positive track record overall, and primarily because we've invested in highly trained staff. To be an operator at LOTT, it takes 2.5 years of being an apprentice before you can have the responsibility of an operator, and then there's levels up from there. We have a process control supervisor, as well as a process control lead, and a whole team that looks at microbes and talks about process every week together and every day in between those. We have a very flexible and adaptive capital improvement plan. And this is different than what you see in most utilities. A lot of times they plan out, cities plan out a 6-year sewer plan, or they build a plant and grow into it. We have a very adaptive, flexible system. And it's because of how LOTT's built, but it's also just part of our DNA, and it's paid off over time. Our board and community have been in strong support for a number of years. We try to be out there in the community, be transparent and communicate about the cost of treating to these high levels and all the things that we're doing and the benefits of it. And we've seen positive reactions to that. And then having a very stable and long-term finance plan. And briefly what this looks like is just, grabbed a snapshot of our biennial budget here in 2021 and 2022. And you can see the rate adjustments that were planned 6 years ago. Well, for the 6-year plan earlier in 2018. And this 3% adjustment is just to keep up with the cost of building this infrastructure. You think about inflation numbers right now being really high, and sometimes they're low, right? But if we can be stable and do rate adjustments just to keep up with the cost of construction, which is between the debt service and construction, it's 75% of our budget is just upgrades in the infrastructure it takes. So that stable financial plan has resulted in the cities of Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, because then essentially they add their own cost of collection system in order to get it to LOTT treatment. But what the end user bill is below the average when we compare. Every 2 years we do a comparison, and you have to look at it with a grain of salt on different ones and different things, but trying to equalize them all, we do below the average. We're below the average in the cost for treating the best on Puget Sound. So it's a good value for our community because of that stability. So in the context of the TMDL that we're talking about, the total maximum daily load limit that for Bud Inlet, and this is a graph, and thank you, Dave, for showing the bar graph of the oxygen depletion. And this is one that we developed that we've shown in different places about really where we sit in the overall oxygen depletion being 3%, and LOTT being the majority of that 3%, as Dave showed. And the external sources to the north is at 20%, as Dave showed, in Capitol Lake. So this is why LOTT took a position on Capitol Lake saying, yes, every part of this pie chart needs to happen, right? Everybody needs to make reductions, including Capitol Lake, including these other sources. And so that's why also we're in favor of the general permit, because we see that as a mechanism to address that 20% contribution from the north. And that's impacting us down here at Butt Inlet. As far as compliance for LOTT within the general permit, we've invested a lot over time over the past 3 decades into doing nutrient removal. So we're in a good place right now. That the thing that'll change for us is doing year-round nutrient removal, which we've already shifted to. We're just have this permit that says we have a pound limit for nutrients, which we can meet with the very stringent controls that we put in place. But we already operate under the nutrient, not the nitrogen limits. And so what that position on the general permit says too is that if these other sources aren't addressed, there's a very real risk for our community that Ecology could say, well, we need to go ahead and turn the dials that we can turn. So go ahead and we're going to ratchet down a little further. So at being 3% of the total pie, we're really getting to be at the limit, and we have plans in the future to continue the treatment level, but really it's a better investment overall to address those to the north and then continue to do as well as we can down here to the south. The permit limits then from 1987 through where we are today, using what I showed you before, here's what happens in the TMDL. There's the BOD and the total inorganic nitrogen in the summer months of August and September. This is where they would go. They would get ratcheted down further. And so that's part of our planning is when we did this last upgrade for nutrient removal, okay, we're planning on needing to meet these lower levels, and we need to make this investment because, and as Kevin said, as more and more people move to town, these limits are set. So we need to keep getting our concentration and our total load down and manage that as the population and contribution into the system grows. This is all backed up by a wastewater resource management plan that was done in the late 90s that really set all of this into motion. And it identified public values of treating wastewater as a resource, looking for environmental benefits and looking at those community benefits of, and you'll see that in LOTT facilities, we try to look to combine necessary infrastructure to see if we can leverage that or partner for a community benefit. And then long-term, we do very detailed planning. We want to be able to adjust to changing conditions. With all the flow that comes into Butt Inlet, especially in the wintertime, but a lot of flow comes in Butt Inlet, the plan is to continue to discharge, but treat to a very, very high level, and then look to expand reclaimed water as those end user needs develop, and particularly in Lacey as those develop. So as wastewater flow increases to that Martin Way treatment plant, we can upgrade it to provide that resource of reclaimed water back to the community. So we call that our highly managed plan. And we submit, and when that highly managed plan, every year we submit to the Department of Ecology these 3 key reports, which looks at our capacity, which looks at what population projections and the flows and nutrient loads are coming down, and inflow and infiltration. So there's a lot that's spent on planning, but it pays off in the end rather than have stranded infrastructure. So we're doing master planning right now, looking out to 2050. We're master planning the Butt Inlet treatment plant site. We're looking at capacity long-term, how reclaimed water capacity can be developed and how we can be flexible as the cities and needs of our community develop. We'll revisit and update the management strategies in that original plan and incorporate new information. We learned that operating a satellite facility at Martin Way, it's a great facility, but it takes a certain amount of resources for people to head out there and manage remote facilities. So centralization is important to us, but we're still committed to developing that infrastructure as the need grows out there. And then just stay flexible. That's really key. And staying flexible, for example, the Woodland Creek facility, that's the Lacey infiltration site for offsetting potable supplies. As those needs emerge, then LOTT is in a position to be able to adapt and expand capacity and provide that in line with our capacity needs assessment. Stay nimble, keep revisiting that strategy. The community benefits, they grabbed a picture of the Tumwater tank, as we call it. So it's a 1 million gallon reclaimed water tank that's needed because of that instantaneous, in general, that flow that's needed to irrigate the golf course. So that tank is filled and then is used for beneficial use to offset potable water for irrigation. But we collaborated there with the city of Tumwater. So then the Tumwater came back and built a park on top of it. So it's that kind of thing that we look to partner on when there's a mutual benefit. And then I mentioned before, centralizing and having stable financials. So a lot more on our website. And one of the things to share out that's on there, in addition to many more videos, is the annual report. We didn't have any pollutant exceedances in the Butt Inlet. It's our primary goal. But we also have beneficial end products of the reclaimed water and biosolids that and energy generation. There's heat that's provided to the Children's Museum. There's energy generated from the biogas in our engine generator. So these are things that we keep at a high value internally to the extent that we can to produce these end products. So I'll stop there. And I know there's a question on biosolids, but maybe I'll just defer to the end when those all get collated.
Thanks, Matt. That was actually the first question in the chat. So if you want to go ahead and answer, that was from Joel Carlson. What about using sewage biosolids to make biofuel?
It's a good question. And there's a lot of good uses for biosolids. In particular, just to say how we use biosolids right now. So they're treated to a Class B product. There's really, think about, there's a Class A and Class B are really the two primary ones. Class A would be approved for human use in the sense of you could use it in your garden, or you could use it pretty much anywhere. There's no restrictions. Class B doesn't take as much energy and but is approved to use on agricultural fields at agronomic rates. So we're part of a program from King County that puts biosolids on wheat farms in Eastern Washington and Douglas County. So all of our biosolids go to beneficial use there. And it's certainly something we're tracking as the needs emerge. So things like using it for fuel or other things, I mean, those are all on the table. It just, we have a working program right now that is going to a beneficial end product.
Cool. Looks like Dave Peeler has his hand up. Oh, you're muted, Dave.
Okay, thank you, Matt, so much. That was a really great presentation on the history of LOTT and what you guys have done over the last 30 years in order to, deal with the treatment plant down there. And it seemed to me when you were describing the 2020 upgrade, where you talked about improved control and flexibility that resulted in the energy savings, that seemed to me to be pretty similar to what Ecology is asking the other treatment plants to do initially, which is just look at your overall system and look for sort of the easy, cost-effective fixes that aren't going to take 10 years and aren't going to cost, hundreds of millions of dollars, as opposed to building entirely new infrastructure. And that really is what Ecology was asking for, that first step of all the other treatment plants. And, you really did a great job, Matt, of showing why LOTT is such an outstanding, treatment plant compared to almost all the other treatment plants in the state, really, but in Puget Sound in particular, because most of the other treatment plants have only done those two basic steps. They went from primary to secondary treatment. And they've really not done much more than that, except continue to ask to expand their treatment plant so they can actually, discharge even more, pollution into Puget Sound, but with the same level of treatment, which is not what LOTT has done starting back, years ago when LOTT decided, and in a way was needed to because of the studies done on Butt Inlet, et cetera, but decided that we're going to take a different tack. We're going to be look out in the future and we're going to try different approaches so that we can deal with this over time. And gosh, look where you're at compared to the other plants. It's just really an incredible story. Sorry, that's not a question, is it? So
no, well said. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just in our community, like we should be proud of that collective investment that we've made. Yeah.
And Dave Peeler, Kevin had a question for you in the chat where he asked, do any of these permits require risk reduction strategies for substances other than nutrients?
Currently, my basic answer would be no. but there may be some instances where that is the case. Going back to how Sean was describing the Clean Water Act permits at the beginning when they were first issued back in the 1970s. You know, when we first got those permits issued, they were very basic. It was, especially for sewage treatment plants, and we're still living with some of those outcomes today, i.e., you have to monitor for biological oxygen demand and a few other parameters, and those will be limited, have limits in the permit for how much can be discharged. And that's still the case for most of the sewage treatment plants today, even though they've upgraded secondary treatment. So those limits went down when that happened for those few pollutants that were required to be monitored and limited. But unless there has been a determination locally by the Department of Ecology that there's some pollutant in their discharge other than those basic ones that's going to cause or contribute to a violation of water quality standards in their receiving waters, they do not have to treat for or monitor for those other pollutants. Now, that's the general statement. They do have to do, once every 5 years, they do a more generalized monitoring for pollutants that are in their wastewater, so we can make that determination about whether they're likely to cause an exceedance of standards for a range of pollutants. And when they're testing for that larger range, it can be up to 100 different pollutants. So it may or may not include all the ones that were shown in some of the slides today, but it is a much wider range than the few that they are required to monitor for and be limited for today. Even if the nutrient general permit is imposed, of course, that will add new limits for nitrogen to the majority of the treatment plants, but it won't extend, to any other pollutants that might be in or that we might be interested in. And certainly we know today that there are a lot of other, pollutants that are getting into Puget Sound that potentially are or are now causing problems for the ecosystem.
All right, we're getting some hands raised. And we go with the first one I saw was Sean from Puget Soundkeeper.
Yeah, so thanks. And I just want to follow up a little bit on that. And I told you, Dave, that you were there in the 70s for those first permits. I said Dave was probably there, but, it's really, looking back at those early permits as well, keep in mind the plan originally with the Clean Water Act was to end the discharge of pollution by 1985. So the goal was to invest in these plants, was to give permits, and then every 5 years have the permit say, get down to 10 milligrams per liter, then the next permit go down to 5, and then the next one go down to 0, because we can get there, right? Incentivize technology and investment in modernization. And I think, it would be really interesting to see a study pick a pollutant and look to see what the levels were and how quickly we plateaued or where we plateaued. And I bet you for some of them, we plateaued really early, scrubbing out arsenic from sewage plants or something like that. Some of them, like nitrogen, maybe we're not plateaued yet, or there's still a bunch of people that haven't done anything. But that was the underlying goal, was each iteration of a permit to try to get lower and lower and lower. That was, designed to connect, to get past this concept of waiting until something completely fails and then wholesale replacing it. That's not useful. That's not effective. It's really more to, slowly change out old systems, upgrading over time, adaptively managing systems, putting in something new when you can and where you can, and just constantly being an investor in adaptively managing your system, but keeping it up to date and modernized. And really, when it comes down to it, a lot of the problems of how the Clean Water Act functions lead to a lot of this delay. And that's something, we haven't talked about here, but when you've got a 5-year permit, for example, that is supposed to be re-looked at every 5 years, Ecology gets the early documentation on that new permit 2 years before the permit's supposed to be reauthorized, 1 year before it is, if the system's working right, which sometimes it's not because of staffing shortages or other things or complexities beyond today's convo. But then they start looking at the process, put it out for public comment, they get comments back, they put a new one out, then there's litigation over some aspect of it, maybe there's some new study that comes out, maybe they haven't gotten to where they want to go. And then other aspects of the Clean Water Act come to play. So what if a receiving water that Bud Inlet or something like that is getting a new TMDL or getting a new water quality criteria, a new number to describe what we should be aiming for? If that comes out a year after the new permit is supposed to take effect, do you delay that new permit a year so that you can have the new numbers in that permit? What if one of them slips and the other one doesn't? And so a lot of these systems are working at cross purposes on different timescales and timelines, and they're aiming at, just constantly evolving and adaptively managing these facilities, but it doesn't always get that way. As I'm sure the folks that manage these facilities can tell you, something new will pop up or something will change, and you have to take a different look at everything. And a lot of these documents and a lot of these monitoring plans are 10-year monitoring plans and 15-year capital investment projects. So none of the real timelines align here, but for almost all of them, we're past that 1985 zero pollution date that was in the original Clean Water Act.
All right, if nobody has a direct response to Sean there, I'm gonna pass over to Robert, who had their hand up.
Yes, I had a question about stormwater. Stormwater goes in the rivers, the streams, the sound, but basically it doesn't go through the treatment plant. And I'm wondering if that's part of the permit or if it is, and if it is, what are the percentages we would see? And if so, how is it be controlled? And if it does not go through the treatment plant, the same question.
I don't know who wants to respond to this. My understanding is that like somewhere between 60 to 70% of stormwater goes untreated. It goes directly into the sound. And I think there's different stormwater permitting, right? The city of Olympia has a stormwater permit. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to answer, but I can jump in. So there's one permit that is for separate storm sewer systems that municipalities have. And so those don't have any physical connection with the sewage treatment plants. Then there's combined sewer systems, which are in a lot of these regions as well, and most urbanized regions in the country. And those combined systems, obviously, there's some stormwater that goes in there and some sewage. So it's all the same pipe, and those have overflows. So if there's too much water in the system, then they'll overflow and outfall into untreated into local receiving waters. Those are permitted through a very interestingly unique system, the CSO policy, which was just a recommendation document, guidance document, something the EPA wrote up as a way to address these things in the 80s, that Congress wholesale copy and pasted into the Clean Water Act in 1994. Congress basically said, and that's section 503, and just took this giant document and put it in. And so that CSO policy kind of puts CSOs, combined sewer outfalls, into the sewage treatment plant permit. So they're part of that system, but are kind of monitored and modeled and dealt with in different ways than any of the other programs also. So there's that untreated thing also is a great question, Robert, on what's in all those systems, because there are certainly there are different levels of contamination in those different systems, and combined sewers can have lots more sewage in them than other things, but road runoff going off of a parking lot or something like that, that's going to have a lot more toxics, brake dust, the 6 ppd chemical from tires, that's in a lot more of that stuff. And all of this is to say, there's a lot of stormwater that goes into upstream of the sewage plant. I don't know if the LOTT folk want to talk about pre-treatment and how that all folds in, but every system is different. And there's also water bubbling up from the ground that goes into these sewage plants, some of which is treated, some of which discharges out through their storm sewer systems. When old pipes crack, groundwater pushes into them and then eventually makes its way sometimes to the sewage plant where they want to try to reduce that. And sometimes it makes its way out into and it pushes out the stormwater down into sound, also untreated. So it's hugely complicated systems.
Yeah, that was a good explanation. And building on that, the combined system that we have, the sewer and stormwater system in Olympia, is just that legacy of how it was built, right? It was just get everything out and, just get it away from population for a human health approach, I think, and then you just start putting treatment plants at the end and start building from there. So new systems wouldn't be permitted and built with combined systems. And there have been studies over time to separate these systems. Okay, let's separate the storm and sewer, because that way the treatment plant doesn't have to pay the cost of all the pumping is the big part, right? You're pumping it around and to build big infrastructure. at some point it becomes not cost effective because you need to tear up a downtown road in downtown Olympia and everything else you find there, and then you have to build new treatment. So in some way, and sometimes then the LOTT treatment plant can treat that, can screen it, can do all the other things that we do. But we are always looking for ways to separate out where it makes sense, and that cost value changes over time as the economics change. And we do have a program, as Sean mentioned, the inflow and infiltration that comes into pipes and how to treat that. So we've got effectiveness thresholds and programs and stuff in place to assist the cities with that program. So
Thank you.
And Matt, if I could add, this is Dave Peeler again, that that's one of the huge problems up in King County. They have these really large treatment plants, but they also have combined sewers for the most part. And they have a lot of runoff because they have a lot of urban, pavement and buildings and so on. And if you might recall in the last, half dozen years, they've had two really big problems at their big treatment plants with just couldn't handle the amount of water coming through when we had big rainfall, stormwater type events, coupled with the normal sewage coming into their treatment plants. And they had flooded treatment plants, and they've had to spend tens of millions of dollars in order to rebuild some parts of their treatment plants because of the floods within the treatment plant, let alone all of the combined sewer outfalls, overflows happening, going directly into Puget Sound and partially treated and much of it untreated when they had to divert flows directly into Puget Sound instead of going through the treatment plants. So this is a big issue at those big plants, especially. And it's pretty, I hate to talk so great about LOTT again, but Matt, when you talked about LOTT not having any CSOs over the last 14 years, that's a high mark. That's doing well, really well.
Yeah, we try very hard. We had a whole, on January 6th was this really, the snow was melting, the rain was coming. We were, literally on top of the tanks, somebody with a valve key was, feathering in to siphon flow to an offline tank. Yep. We were in 2 feet of having, we were putting water every place we could put it inside the plant. And it's a lot of planning. And whereas some like the King counties, they're just built. They have CSOs, they do that. We have equalization tanks, we have systems in place, but it's something that we really try to never do if we can avoid it at all. And even if we were to have to do that, it would be diluted and as disinfected and treated as we could. And that's what we're built for. But that's what we're looking long-term with sea level rise and all of these other things. How can we continue to build that capacity in place? Yeah.
All right, well, I get a couple more questions in here, and I know Sandra's patiently been waiting for a bit. So if Sandra's available to ask her question.
Yes, I am. I am as old as DERT with a DIRT, and I worked with both the Clean Water Act and the first Shoreline Management Act when that was passed in 1972 and then 73. And a lot of the problems that and I worked for Ecology in the city of Seattle in shoreline and floodplain and water quality management and growth management later on. And so I know a lot about the things that you've talked about and some of the things that you're gonna face now will continue to be development pressure, and that has a lot, is responsible for a lot of the Seattle combined sewer overflow problems, because they're in growth management. The Growth Management Act required there be concurrence, which meant that you have everything in place at once before you go forward with something else. And that really never happened. And it's nice to see that the LOTT participants are really taking that into taking that into account when before you assumedly before you let people expand further with your needs for either septic systems or for sewer hookups, because Seattle has not done that and will not do that. And that's because of development pressure. And that, having been a shoreline and floodplain management planner in Department of Ecology for over 25 years, I would say that is the biggest thing that we will be facing, statewide, is the pressure to go forward quickly before you have everything else in place. That's all.
Thank you, Sandra. Yeah, no, Kevin and both of his presentations has really emphasized the pressure that population growth is putting on straining the water system.
It's not population, though. It isn't. It is development pressure. I mean, you have like Seattle where there's like development pressure to create more apartments and stuff, but still the occupancy is only less than 70%. So some of it's a very flimsy argument.
All right, and then Judy has their hand up.
Hi, this might be a question for Sean. I just wanted to get a little bit more information. You said when you have a combined system and if it gets overloaded, that the water or the effluent can actually get pushed out of the pipe. Could you explain that a little bit more? And could you also explain something about infiltration and inflow and how that might factor into a combined system?
Yeah, so I think that there's, and Matt might be able to help me with the I&I and the IDDE stuff, but combined sewer systems, very much when people build them, they're like, hey, why don't we put both systems in one big pipe? And wouldn't that be easier to deal with and get it out of here, like Matt said? And so a lot of those systems were built that way. And there's a couple cool infographics online that I don't want to take time to search for and pull up. But long story short, if there weren't an escape valve on CSOs, on the combined sewer system, when you had all the stormwater from the rain going in and then shunting into the one pipe where there was a lot of where it all combined, if you didn't have all that, if you didn't have escape valve for that, then sewage and stormwater would start backing up into people's homes and it would start bubbling up out of the grates on the side of the street, right at the curb. And so the systems were like, well, this was a great idea. Let's put them all in one pipe, but we have to have that outfall if there's too much rain. And so when it goes down a hill, down the gradient, down the pipe, and it gets close to the water's edge, there's usually a weir in the system. So a little kind of, a berm in the pipe itself, over which there's an overflow and the sewage, the combined sewage and stormwater then just gets discharged into a local waterway. And, how much is water, how much is sewage depends on the area. And so, 90% stormwater, 10% sewage is kind of a rule of thumb, in some places but it's important to note that not all of that sewage is raw feces. Most of what's in sewage is not feces. And so when that number isn't always just feces, it's 10% feces. But then also the stormwater isn't just beautiful, clean, pristine rainwater coming down. It's run off the road. It's picked up all those chemicals. If it hasn't rained for a bunch of days, then a lot of garbage can build up and a lot of toxics can build up on streets. And so when there's a heavy deluge that pushes it all into a plug of horribleness, and if it's a flash flood and a huge rainstorm, then that kind of bubbles up in the system and is violently moving through the system, and it can splash over those weirs and those combined sewer outfalls. And so you get more of the solids coming out than you otherwise would if it was a slow and steady rain, where a treatment plant can handle some of that stuff and take some of the pressure off and keep the solids flowing through, which, sewage plants have professional staff that know their whole system and can throttle where the sewage is moving back and forth, literally with pumps in the system, to make sure that they're shunting as much of the pressure to the treatment plant as possible. But as you can imagine, all this takes a huge investment in infrastructure just to maintain those systems, as opposed to separating them. But separate systems shunt all of those toxic chemicals and debris and plastic pollution and cigarette butts and oil and grease and everything that's in the streets directly in without even the slightest chance of sewage treatment. So all of this kind of goes back to Sandra's point, which is like, maybe we shouldn't be making more of this stuff in the first place, which is your question on the volume in there. And it would be a completely different situation if it was just, if what was in these sewers were just rainwater and sewage. But because these pipes were laid down 100 years ago, 80 years ago, 50 years ago, all these pipes, when they crack, groundwater can bubble up, or there can be pipes that are, unintentionally or intentionally welded from one system to another, and are discharging what they think is into a separate system that goes to the treatment plant, but instead it's just going right out into the street, into the sewer, into the storm drain. And so all of those things, places like LOTT track down and have in their budgets. So I'll stop talking and leave it to LOTT, and have in their budgets every year. We're going to replace 15 miles of this every year. We're going to invest in testing to see where those are. We're going to daylight new streams, because back in the day, when people were building out communities, if there was a stream that went through a housing project or an area of new development, instead of building around a stream, they would just shunt that stream into a storm drain and then make their city grid over it. And so there's all these streams out there that are groundwater sourced or that are fed by, up in the watershed, that just get shunted, literally channelized and put into the storm drain and are part of that flow. So you could have 100 million gallons coming down one of your sewer mains to the sewage treatment plant, but like 40 million gallons of that is a giant stream that somebody put into the sewer 100 years ago and you didn't know about it. And so turning that stream back into a normal stream gets it out of the sewer, and then all of a sudden you don't have to pay as a ratepayer for that to be treated. So these are super complex systems.
That was a great explanation, Sean. I really don't have much to add other than saying what LOTT does, specifically with regard to trying to track down that inflow and infiltration. So we have these monitoring sites out in the system, as you mentioned, and they rotate around, and we track that to the rain, right? So if it's raining and we see the peak and flow, we know that that's attributed. But in times in the summer, no rain for a while, and we see higher flows than we measured last year, or based on some population correction, then we notify the cities, and then the cities who are responsible for the majority of the collection system, and they can take action if it's not a LOTT system. So some collaboration there.
All right, we are about out of time, but I do want to take the opportunity to ask Kevin one more question, if Kevin's still with us.
Yes, speak.
So I'm kind of recall, I was reading through a City of Olympia publication a couple of years ago on on-site septic systems, and I believe the figure was something like 97% of the soil, the geology in Thurston County, is not suitable to OSS because of the glacial till. And so is that part of the big problem with OSS in this region? And would it be different in other regions if the geology was different than the glacial till?
Okay, so that's a tricky question. Obviously, it's site dependent. So you want percolation. Soil is fantastic at removing contamination, particularly fecal denitrification processes is great in soil. It's something that soil is just magnificently suited to do. So that being said, if it percolates too quickly or doesn't percolate quickly enough, if it doesn't hit that sweet spot of soil characteristics, the system needs to be adapted to the actual kind of soil that's present. So that the design of the system under modern standards is supposed to adapt the percolation rate and the type of soil, the height of groundwater, et cetera, to the design of the system in order to achieve the removal efficiencies that are desired. So that's my long-winded way of saying, I guess I would not stand behind a blanket 90+% unsuitable soils. I think that is dependent upon the design. There are certainly a lot of systems put in the past using methodologies that we wouldn't recommend today. Some of them fail, and that's an ongoing battle we wage because we permit the septic systems. Anyway, is that close to your question?
Yeah, that helps. Yeah, so when they're installing the actual septic system, they can design a field to really help make it more suitable.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And they have to get training in order to do that. The state works with them. We work with them. Then we have a retrofit and inspection program, particularly in sensitive areas, to help. Although it's an ongoing battle to try to stay ahead of compliance on older systems. And I think we're underfunded right now. So one of the questions we have in front of the commissioners is to somehow bootstrap the system up so we can make sure that there are fewer compliance issues, better standards, and better compliance.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining us and all of the attendees as well. It's a really rich conversation tonight. I learned a lot and really excited to return to in-person community forums in the future. And I think we will continue to offer in a virtual format as well when we do in person, hybrid as Paige said. And I think I'll pass over to Paige and see if she has any final thoughts.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you to all of our guests. I think I speak for everyone when we are all left with more questions than we walked into and the desire to learn even more. And I see that as DERT's role in the community to continually connect everyday people with the expertise of these professionals, and vice versa. We need to keep doing this together. And guest speakers, thank you so much for being here and doing that for us, and community members. And then one and the same to thank you for being here. Please stay tuned for more information about our May and June forums. May will be all about climate change, particularly about comments made by individuals and professionals on the EIS comment period. For example, Pamela Braff, our City of Olympia climate manager, will be our keynote speaker. And then in June, it's Orca Month. So we are doing a forum on Puget Sound and Deschutes watershed wildlife. So stay tuned for those. More information will be going out. And the best way to hear about that is on social media. We are at Deschutes Estuary on Instagram, and then the full Deschutes Estuary Restoration Team on Facebook. And our email newsletter goes out once a month, the second to last Thursday of the month. And you can subscribe to that on our homepage at DeschutesEstuary.org. And one last thing, if you would like to support this community forum series, if you have the means, please consider making a contribution to DERT. Every little bit helps us move our mission forward, especially in this amazing pivotal time where dam removal is gonna happen. It's just a matter of how soon, how's it gonna be done, and who are we gonna be cheering alongside as this process happens? And that's all of you. So we are over time, so I'm not gonna take up any more of your night. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you soon. Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.
Good
night.